And one of the reasons why we're doing this is to perhaps better understand ourselves as we study all history in that case. As I've oftentimes said, history is essentially psychology writ large. And in this particular case, there's something about so many of these situations with disease and how people coped with them and dealt with them and were traumatized by them that I find so universal. And one case comes from a fellow Midwesterner, a guy by the name of A.Q. Allen. He's from a small farming community in northern Illinois called Mount Morris. And on April 26, 1863, he pens a letter to his nephew, John Leake of the 92nd Illinois, who's stationed in the Union Army in Tennessee. And the note contained a prophetic phrase. He said, "John, this war is an awful thing, and I fear many more valuable lives will be lost. You are exposed to many dangers." Well, when we're looking at this, he knows something that we oftentimes forget. Those dangers are primarily health related and not necessarily to bullets. It turns out that I don't know if John Leake ever got this message. While it was in transit, that letter, well, John came down with flu-like symptoms, and as a precautionary measure, his doctors sent him to the regimental tent, a tent filled with his other fellow comrades who were coughing and sick with various ailments. And one of his hometown friends, a Private Charles Faulkner, stopped by and paid John a visit. And what he saw in that tent immediately prompted him to write home. Said, "John Leake is very sick with lung fever." And 10 days later, Faulkner wrote home again. "I will tell you one thing, it will be pretty hard for Mrs. Leake to hear. Poor John is no more. He died last night after a long spell of sickness." It turns out that John and all of these people were living in a strange and amazing time called the 19th century, the focus of my historical profession, and it is a time of ingenuity and invention, including interchangeable parts, steam engines, urban factories, and mass industrial production. And all those things were formed in the early 1800s. We also know that among many other breakthroughs, there was also germ theory, intravenous vaccines, antiseptic surgery, and nursing schools. Unfortunately for John and others, those are all invented and found and discovered in the late 1800s. The one time a nation does not want to have a war is in the middle 1800s, and that befell us. When we look at this sort of thing, it's something that's mind-boggling. At his peak, George Washington had an army of 20,000 men. During the Civil War, 20,000 would be considered just a field army of relatively large size, but nothing necessarily spectacular. 2 million men under uniform in the Union and 1 million under the Confederacy. This industrial revolution of production enables these armies to take the field. And just to give you one statistic to show you how productive these factories are, Confederate and Union, mostly Union, of course, factories produced 2 billion bullets during the war. That's enough for 2 bullets for every human being then existing on Earth. But then again, what is more deadly? At the same time, one person with tuberculosis could cough out 4 billion tuberculosis bacilli in a single day. The years of study it took to become a medical doctor, 2, and almost none of it hands-on. The number of microscopes at Harvard Medical School in 1860, 0. What is the primary cause of these massive diseases? And that's one of the things we're going to be discovering tonight. We can pick each and every one and actually be clinical about it. But I want to look at the bigger picture because we have to too. As our world becomes closer, we have to think of the very same questions that they had to wrestle with. And part of it is a myth that many Confederate soldiers felt, that they were fighting somebody who was soft and city folk, that the Union boys were just from towns and cities and really didn't know what rough country life was like. A great example being, well, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. That was a city. According to the United States Census Bureau in 1860, anything over 2,000 was a city. But I can tell you that 90% of Confederate soldiers, yes, did come from rural areas, something smaller than 2,000, but around 80% of Union troops did too. And as a consequence, they came from spread out areas where contingents were relatively contained. It isn't until the 1860s that the United States actually has one city, one, that has 1 million people in it, and that's New York. And it's still considered not so much metropolitan enough that Brooklyn is considered a separate entity. No, the vast majority of populations are in small areas, but we will see during the course of the war an explosion of urbanization, what I call hyper-urbanization, that places a toll upon the infrastructure and the people therein. A great example, the population of Atlanta, when the war began, was 9,600. Within 3 years, it climbed to 22,000. The population of Washington, D.C. at war start was about 75,000. Very quickly, it rose to 120,000 and more. Refugees, contractors, everybody and anybody who had a place to stay would sometimes have 3 families in one room. Hallways would be used, school rooms, anything for shelter, because the cities were thought to be the safe places. Population of Nashville began at 18,000. By 1864, it was 60,000. When we see this, we're also looking at the places where most of the Civil War dead takes place. You and I go to battlefields, and we don't really quite understand that it's not in the fields and where most of the death happens. It's in the urban areas, and urban areas unlike anybody who had lived there had experienced before. And indeed, there were mobile and stationary cities that would pop up all over the place. Camps would be petri dishes where men who had been living in these very small communities and in farm life were finding themselves congested in areas that were so dense that many Union and Confederate camps had population densities twice of Manhattan. Here I can show you at the end of 1861, here are the location of all Union fortifications and all the support networks around them. By the end of 1863, here are the number of Union fortifications across the North and South. One prime example is Nashville and its explosion of population. This sort of thing ends up being the Industrial Revolution and cheap labor creating a fortress among many others. 10 miles and 8 different major forts, plus a multitude of others across the city. And indeed, as a consequence, they've soon realized Nashville cannot maintain the sick and wounded with its 3 hospitals. The Union Army eventually, by taking over warehouses and businesses, create 25. There is no worse place to be in this hyper-urbanization than in a prison, north or south. The magnitude of human beings who are stuffed into these ghettos, into these tiny little areas with poor sanitation, bad water, and men who are already stressed and poorly fed on both sides, create horrible death. When somebody hops into a battlefield, it's fascinating, but it's hard to comprehend. But they have about a 1 in 30 chance of dying. Places like Chickamauga and Gettysburg are slightly worse, but not by much. But when somebody steps into a Civil War prison, north or south, their chances of dying slips to 1 in 7. And I'll be talking about 3 different diseases and how they had different connotations to the population. When you and I read all these death reports, we oftentimes see from our great-great-great-uncles and great-great-great-grandfathers died of disease, died of sickness. But on the ground, there were actual terms and actual reactions to specific illnesses. And one of the worst was known as the speckled monster, also known as smallpox. This was a devastating disease that people feared long before the Civil War. I would argue no other disease created more fear into the mind of the civilian or the soldier. One of the reasons why you and I are not speaking Cherokee or Choctaw or Lakota Sioux is because of smallpox. It is the deadliest disease in all human history. And nobody needs to tell you better than the Native Americans. The population of North and South America before Christopher Columbus shows up is approximately 50 million. I can tell you that when he and his conquistadors bring with them multitudes of diseases, nothing is more destructive than smallpox. Within 100 years, only about 1 out of 10 Native Americans, North and South, survive it. When Native Americans talk about a genocide, it's the disease that did most of the destruction. The total population of North and South America would not reach 50 million again until, maybe apropos to our discussion, the eve of the Civil War. It's 370 years. You and I oftentimes talk about the people who die in the Civil War, and we know that for every person who dies, 2 will die of disease. Well, I can tell you that's about the death rate for this smallpox. It's around 40%. Of those, oftentimes another and maybe 80% were so incapacitated as to never be a soldier again. And 1 out of 3 survivors would be a carrier of the disease for the remainder of their lives. One of the ways that this differs from other diseases is that the minute that smallpox was detected, among all the other ailments, the person would be isolated. It's perhaps saved tens of thousands of lives during the course of the war. One man in Nashville was discovered to have it, and they isolated him outside of town immediately. It ended up being that he was just one of many who were inflicted. They ended up having to have an entire hospital dedicated to smallpox alone. This is one of the reasons why we need to look at children in history in the Civil War, because it was from children who had smallpox and survived where the most pure and effective form of inoculation came about. George Washington mandated that all of his troops get these inoculations. It would come from the scabs of those who had survived, be scraped off, purified, and dried, and held in little tiny pieces of tin. And those would be distributed to soldiers. There'd be other times when they tried to get it from adults. Anybody over the age of 25, their scabs were rarely all that effective. Sadly, there were cases in which men didn't have smallpox, but they did have scabs. And so doctors would scrape those off, dry them, and administer them. Some of those cases were, in fact, cases of syphilis, where the men would not recover. Some men got so desperate as they would find their own fellows in those isolated tents and take off some of those pustules and go back into the camp with knives and scrape their own skin in hopes of getting a small dose of it. This strikes, and we still don't know how badly, fear into the civilian population most. A great example being the Raleigh Weekly Standard, July 1st, 1863, is angry, beyond angry, because the politicians and doctors don't want to administer this to the very poor. There are scabs and dried inoculations available, but they cost about $5 each, or about half a month's pay for a Confederate soldier. Many families could not afford this. A lot of the politicians could, a lot of the doctors could, a lot of the slave owners could, and they would oftentimes inoculate their own slaves before the impoverished. And the Raleigh Weekly Standard said, "May God and the soldiers forgive doctors and legislators for their unwillingness to prevent the spread of smallpox to the poor and needy." Mr. Rogers of Alamance was seized with smallpox and was deserted by his neighbors and died no one going home to bury him for several days. In Orange, Mr. William Carlton, his wife, his son, and a servant all died. We have had smallpox in Wilson, Wayne, Orange, Alamance, and many other counties. Hundreds of families in Union County who are not now able, never will be able to pay for vaccination. To this day, we have no idea how many civilians died of smallpox. It could be very easily in the tens of thousands. The saddest thing about this is we don't know unless they were in the Union or Confederate Army where records were being taken, or if they were famous. One such case, arguably the most famous case, was Abraham Lincoln. It is oftentimes said he was very disappointed about his speech at Gettysburg after he gave his 272 words, sat down, and was rather despondent. It turns out he thought the speech went really well. It just happened to be he was extremely sick. He'd go back to Washington, a city where people hated him. Many radicals thought he wasn't being strong enough about freeing the enslaved. Many conservatives said he was pushing too hard for abolition. When Abraham Lincoln was informed after his trip to Gettysburg that he actually had variola, a mild form of smallpox, allegedly, he said, "That is good, that is good. Finally, I have something I can give everyone." The estimated number of combatants who died from smallpox is about 15,000, Confederate and Union, and that's just the combatants. Translate that and find out how many would have died today if it was the same proportion of our population. This is just the military. It'd be somewhere around 150,000. Now, we just got a text from one of your fellow roundtable members that they had a relative who died of camp fever. And as many of you know, and as that descendant knows, camp fever was typhoid. Typhoid wasn't as feared as smallpox. And to this day, I'm not entirely sure why. If you go to Franklin, Tennessee, and I invite you to come here, you might go to the Lotz house, a home of a German immigrant family and very close to the front lines of the Battle of Franklin. And oftentimes, despite my wishing they wouldn't, they oftentimes tell of the death of two of their children in the Lotz family, two twins. And the story goes that the twins died from drinking from a well that was poisoned by Union troops. In reality, that wasn't the case. Union troops were drinking from that same well because in 1863, Franklin was a unified city. You oftentimes don't hear this in the tours here in Franklin. They talk about the Battle of 1864. They don't talk about the Union occupation of 1863. Wherein the population of Franklin before the war was 2,000. The front lines of the Civil War was in my adopted hometown of Franklin. And the Union troops swelled the numbers, and the refugees swelled the numbers to 10,000. There was no way this place could handle that kind of capacity. I actually tried to figure out how many people had died from smallpox and other situations here in Franklin. And I went to every record I could find of every cemetery within 2 miles of downtown where the Union troops were located. It turns out that the average was about 14 to 15 deaths a year. During Union occupation, it more than doubled. This is the same case that happens in Atlanta, New Orleans, Washington, D.C., Wilmington, Nashville. That the average rate of civilian population death oftentimes would double or even triple when these places would get overrun with refugees and soldiers. It was too much for the infrastructure to handle. I can also tell you that by my calculations, more Union troops died in 1863 from typhoid and related diseases in Franklin, Tennessee, than died at the Battle of Franklin the year later. In fact, in 1 week, more people died and became sick from typhoid in Little Franklin than typhoid Mary had infected in her entire lifetime. One of the most famous cases of typhoid involves a family living in an area that was overrun by refugees and soldiers. The parents had two young sons, both got terribly sick with typhoid. They nursed them back to health. They got sick again. The youngest boy rallied, but the second did not. He, of course, was William Wallace Willie Lincoln, 11 years old. Abraham Lincoln was inconsolable. He said to his private secretary, John Nicolay, "My boy is gone." Mary Todd never fully mentally recovered. She had lost a son previously in 1850. This was too much to bear. She would wear black for more than a year, and any celebration of any battle victory was not held on White House grounds or in the White House, as it normally would be, for over a year. Both Mary and Lincoln turned to the Bible more than they did ever before, trying to figure out there must be a reason to all this suffering. It's something that we have to consider, that Abraham Lincoln was a dad. And there's a multitude of dads and brothers and sisters and mothers who are getting news from the battlefront. And it isn't these stories of glory and valor and Valhalla that we oftentimes hear from the more militant among us. Now, the vast majority of people who die in all American wars before World War II died of disease. Not until World War II did more soldiers die from wounds and killed in action than died from disease. The one advantage, if there is an advantage from dying of disease, is that oftentimes a family could have closure. Little Willie was, in fact, one who actually went through this very process of embalming inside the White House to preserve the body. Many other families would pay $5 for a private, $10 for a corporal, $50 for an officer to have their loved one embalmed. There's a science that was just taking off, and therein is perhaps the only positive aspect of having your loved one die of disease rather than combat. A much, much higher percentage were able to be identified, and many were sent back home. One embalmer actually enjoyed the fact that there was a war going on. He said, "I'm not going to make a killing like this in a lifetime." The estimated number of soldiers who died from typhoid, 64,800. That's conservatively. To give you an idea of how many that is, that's more who died than in Vietnam. That's more Americans who died in Vietnam. There's more Americans than died at the Battle of Gettysburg, and 1st and 2nd Manassas, and Chickamauga, and Franklin, and Nashville combined. And again, if we lose that many today, we're talking about a death toll that is very close to what we have lost in COVID. Now, the last of the three was called the fluxes, the runs. It also is known by its Latin name, diarrhea, and dysentery. Diarrhea is actually ancient Greek for I flow away. The quick step. This was an odd disease, and so many people just accepted it as part of life. That if we were to look at the number of soldiers who were in action for more than 2 or 3 months, the number who actually got dysentery in the course of a year was about 99%. Unlike things like typhoid, where 1 in 3 would die, or smallpox, where 1 in 3 would die, usually only about 1 in 20, 1 in 25 would die, but these guys would catch it again and again and again, to the point that we're almost becoming different. It's one of many reasons why I never will do any reenactment. I actually know if I were actually going to be an accurate reenactor, one of the things I would do is complain of having diarrhea. It's probably one of the reasons why I didn't get invited to a lot of dances at these reenactments, but that's another thing. Anyway, Doctors would say this almost every time they ran into a soldier: how are your bowels? That was the number one thing a doctor would see. And it would be again and again. They would administer all kinds of things: teaspoons of turpentine, sulfur chloride. You know, and I know, one of the most common things administered was a horrible amount of opioids and indeed mercury. One of the reasons why this is such a problem at this time: this is a food and water contaminant. And the food and water in this area was almost always contaminated. It's one of the reasons why several soldiers actually looked forward to going on marches, because they knew they were walking away from cities, camps, and fortifications that were death zones. A great example is the fact that they had to live around human and animal feces whenever they were in these areas. One statistic I find rather frightening is each draft animal, each and every one, produced on average around 24 pounds of feces and urine every 24 hours. In order to administer these medicines, these men actually just did what they did before the war. And a lot of this is mass produced, especially for Union troops, things like blue mass, which of course was mercury and horribly poisonous. One of the problems about this, though, is that in trying to introduce this essential poison into the body, the idea was to flush out the system and as a consequence dehydrate the body and oftentimes cause renal shutdown. By 1863, Surgeon General of the Union Army, William Hammond, said, this obviously isn't working. This mercury-based medicine, these lead-based medicines, these men are losing teeth, they're losing jaw lines, they're getting horribly sick, dehydrated, dying. I don't think this works. We have to find a better way. He was summarily called a quack and dismissed. The estimated number of combatant dead from dysentery and diarrhea, 95,000. Indeed, that's nearly 1 million human beings from something that was, for the most part, treatable. When it comes to the Civil War, there are parts of it we simply look away, and that includes disease. We can learn from this, and I fear, as I live in the county in which I do, people are becoming more as if we are living with diarrhea than living with smallpox and typhoid. They're going back to their old ways. They're becoming indifferent. They're getting used to some sort of normalcy that isn't normal. We have valuable lessons to learn from our age and theirs. When we have people tightly put into small areas, when we urbanize faster and faster without adequate infrastructure, we suffer horribly. Too many times we'll look upon cemeteries like this one at Vicksburg and not really do the basic math that 2 out of every 3 headstones we are looking at was a victim of disease, not of bullets. We need to walk by those headstones and realize those men sometimes died very quickly, as with smallpox. It could be within 48 hours. Typhoid was much worse. It could take a month of horrible suffering. Things like the common cold could kill a human being. Diphtheria, something that we don't even fear much anymore. A rusty nail would kill a human being because tetanus was 100% fatal during the war. Wilmington, Memphis, New Orleans suffered massive yellow fever outbreaks that killed entire families. There have been statistical analyses of the demographics at that time of who suffered most during the war. And I can tell you, there is one demographic that undoubtedly, at least by way of death, had almost no variation between pre and wartime death rates, and that was Southern white women between the ages of 10 and 40. There are many who claim they suffered more than anybody else. In reality, they were oftentimes in rural areas the very last to die, especially those who were wealthy. Indeed, we find out then as now, if somebody was impoverished, if someone was paid poorly, lived in difficult conditions, in tightly cramped areas, they were the ones who were going to be suffering the most. Jim Downs writes a brilliant book called Freedom from Sickness. Many African Americans would escape during the war, and most of them who were escaping during the war were females taking their families to Union lines in hopes of saving their children. As Jim Downs notes, that when they did enter Union lines, they were, again, placed in contraband camps, paid poorly, if not at all, fed the worst of the food, and oftentimes suffered horribly. He estimates that 1 out of 4 runaway slaves would die, most of them children. In the case of the Civil War soldier, we know that 2 out of 3 who died would die of disease, and the other third would die of combat and wounds. But when we look at African American soldiers, of 15 who would die in the course of the war, 14 would die of disease, and 1 would die of combat. Altogether, if we were to look at this and conservatively estimate, this is just for the soldiers alone. The number of combatants who died from diseases is somewhere in the neighborhood of 450,000, or about the population of every man, woman, and child currently living in Tennessee. I don't want to get preachy on any of this, but I do want us to learn. I don't subscribe to the idea that if we don't study history, we're bound to repeat it, because I keep reminding my students, much of history is wonderful. We were all born. That's a great thing. We have inventions like the steam engine and germ theory and the light bulb and the internal combustion engine, and indeed the internet that can communicate with each other when we haven't had a chance to see almost anybody during our own pandemic. But when I look at the Civil War, I look at all of it. I see it as us just in different clothing. And what can we learn from each other? We learn civic responsibility. I live in a state where many people are refusing to get inoculated. And the consequence, one of the things that frightens me as a historian about this is it is very much like typhoid. A person can show no symptoms and yet be a carrier. Even though I'm afraid of needles, I run to needles now, because finally, by my 50s, I realized inoculations are not about me. They're about people like John Leake and young kids and older populations that won't survive something that I will. I see this time and time again in the diaries and the letters and the notes and the editorials that were written during the Civil War, and for whatever reason, we ignore them. I invite you, as many of you do have relatives, to look deeper into your own genealogy and find those stories. Simply because they didn't die in the valor of battlefields doesn't mean they should be forgotten. That's one of the reasons I want to simply end this by thanking you. I am preaching to the choir. It's a Civil War roundtables that look at the big picture. It's a Civil War roundtables that get together and talk honestly. It's a Civil War roundtables that I think are family therapy from a trauma we're still recovering from. If there's anything to learn from you guys in Brunswick, and I learned this when I met you for the first time back in January, right before the pandemic started, we are at our best when we are together. And that's the only way we're going to survive. So thank you for all you do. Keep up the good work and keep looking at history, warts and all. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much, Tom. Excellent presentation. We got a few questions for you.
Sure.
One of them is, which side had the worst disease rate?
It depended on the disease. On cases like yellow fever, it was really close. On cases like diarrhea and dysentery, it seemed as if Union troops suffered more because there were simply more Union troops. One thing that Union troops did suffer horribly from was malaria. There was a certain amount of acclimation that many white Southerners and African Americans had developed over time. And indeed, they had, ironically, better access to quinine in the first couple of years. So yellow fever and malaria rates were lower for Southern whites and African Americans at the beginning of the war than it were for Northerners, because this is a relatively new disease from people like from Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. But when the war started happening, we see this again, and we're seeing this during the pandemic right now. It's not unlike starvation during the war. By 1863, Confederacy, Confederacy, Confederacy. Throughout the war, the Confederacy is producing more than enough food. It just can't get the food to the people. And that's the same thing that's happening to the Confederacy then, and that's the same thing that's happening to developing countries now. The world has more than enough vaccines to vaccinate every human being. They will in about 6 months. It's getting people connected to that food, connected to the health, connected to the networks, connected to the vaccine. And by 1865, it's just so disproportionate that, and the sad thing about this is that I argue one of the reasons why the Confederacy falls apart is that, again, the argument of what's so beautiful about roundtables and community centers. The communication network breaks down. New Yorkers were finding out about the Battle of Franklin in 24 hours. People 100 miles away from Franklin in the South weren't hearing about it for 2 weeks. Information about their loved ones, about battles, access to food, access to medicine, telegraph networks, railroads, riverboats, it's all gone by 1864. I argue one of the reasons why the Confederacy lost is each and every community felt like it was utterly alone.
Okay. Did the Civil War experience with diseases help in the post-war research and discovery of cures or prevention?
The sad thing about this is there were some progress made. There was an understanding by the Civil War, the idea of bloodletting was already passé. They knew not to do it. It would just stabilize the body. But eventually people did start to learn that mercury was not the way to go and lead-based medicines were not the way to go. And yet it still took the 1903 Pure Food and Drug Act to get people to start labeling their drugs. And even then, those drugs contained opiates, high rates of alcohol, cocaine. It's amazing how little the United States actually learned. The one thing it did learn was the idea of traumatic surgery. Those improved over time. There are many doctors who could perform an amputation within 15 minutes, and that isn't like cutting through a Braunschweiger. That's actually pulling back the healthy skin, finding the material that can survive, suturing off arteries, having the bone, this is getting graphic, having the bone polished down so it doesn't poke through. By the end of the war, traumatic surgery was improving exceptionally, but medical ignorance just continued and continued and continued to the point where in 1898, the United States Army was still not inspecting its food. When there were men in Cuba and the Philippines fighting for the United States against the Empire of Spain, they're getting fed mass-produced poison. An untold number of men die from eating just contaminated, gray, rotted meat. It wasn't until the 1930s and 40s. In fact, that's how Harry Truman becomes vice president. He's this guy from a Missouri high school degree, but he knows you don't cheat people, and he becomes the greatest inspector of all United States contracts. And then eventually the Democrats realized, man, this guy's inscrutable. He's wonderful. We can't, he is the kind of purist we needed this whole time. And that's how he's able to ascend in the government, is he's looking at these contracts and he realizes the Japanese, the Germans, the Italians are killing us fast enough. We don't need to help them with bad food and water.
Exactly. In your research, are the POW camps far worse for, statistically in these three main diseases?
They are horrific on all counts. I'm from Iowa, and I don't live too far from Rock Island. And there was a newspaper called the Rock Island Argus that could see Rock Island Arsenal and the Civil War camp, excuse me, and could see the soldiers dying. And so much of it was from smallpox and pneumonia. Pneumonia was a massive killer during the war. In fact, pneumonia maintains itself, along with heart disease, as one of the #1 killers well into the early 20th century. And the editors go, Union be damned, you can't treat human beings like this. And the guards are dying too. You can go to places like this, and every disease could run rampant at these Civil War prison camps, North and South. They were horrible. In fact, I think in 1864, when, because of a multitude of different reasons, when the prisoner exchange negotiations break down, more Americans die as POWs in 1864 than I believe all the other years combined in our nation's history. It just horrifically high rates North and South. Boy, I'm cheering everybody up. Sorry about that, but yeah, it's truly phenomenal what human beings are capable to do each other when we're on our best and when our worst. We're a strange animal.
Did it appear that one side versus the other had better doctors, nurses, better access to supplies, medicines?
It really depended. Of course, the North did have a much better access to Europe and had where the best medical schools were. The United States still didn't have a professional nursing school, but where the North had an advantage was later in the war was, again, transportation. There were people who were located deep in the South in occupation areas that they were getting fresh fruits, fresh vegetables from home because the rail and river networks were so good by the end of the war that just to keep the soldiers healthy, the Union infrastructure, the transportation really benefited them. So that was part of it. Also the nursing aspect. The vast majority of nurses at the beginning of the war for both sides were either servants, the enslaved, or soldiers who couldn't fight. By 1864, the Union finally begrudgingly accepted a lot of females and most were middle class, well educated. And this is still a big problem for a lot of people. The idea of a female looking upon a naked man's body was still too difficult for many people to handle. All the way to the end of the war, the vast majority of Confederate nurses were enslaved males. By the end of the war for the Union, though, there was this idea that, and when I say nurses, actually, the vast majority of nursing involved cleaning, cooking, and just being there for somebody. And indeed, that's how we survive today. The first line of defense in any illness is the home. The Union by 1864, a lot of middle-class women, at least in most ears, were able to say, I'm a nurturing type, this is natural to me. In reality, the vast majority of doctors, of course, nearly all of them are male, but the Union's able to to mobilize females much better than the South ever did. And that indeed saves untold numbers of lives.
All right. Our final question. What was done in the camps to prevent disease, such as the quick step? Did they start doing anything special over time?
The biggest thing was to have horse pens and mule pens farther away from the tents, and to have the latrines in areas that were not upstream. There was a slow realization that this had to be done in order to prevent, and indeed, things like cholera, smallpox, or not smallpox, that's not unlike COVID, that's spread by contact and breath, but typhoid, dysentery, diarrhea. The vast majority of people who died during the war by way of disease, it's food and water based. So better food preparation, moving latrines. The idea of smallpox inoculations really starts to take off, especially in the North, including among the communities, because many of these guys go back home during their leaves of absences. The two groups I was talking about from the Raleigh Standard, both families were stricken because the fathers went to go visit their sons in camp, caught smallpox, brought it back home, and they didn't know. This is something that worries me when people are going back on vacation right now, because who knows what you're carrying with you or taking back. In reality, the beautiful thing about this, though, is I think at that time, when you read these letters, when you read these newspaper reports, when you read the diaries, the people really start to get sympathetic. And that includes, like the Rock Island Argus, they get sympathetic about their enemies. It's something I discussed last time when I was with you guys about the idea of shared trauma. People still had a hatred for the opposing side. But when they got into these communities and they got close to each other, I mean, nowhere were Union soldiers, African Americans, and Confederate civilians close to each other than in these cities. And when they started to see each other suffer, they really started to feel for each other. And when they stopped talking about politics and start talking about humanity, there's these beautiful moments where people started to truly say, we can't treat each other this way. And indeed, the Union government eventually realizes we have to even treat this contraband like human beings, because they're the ones who are doing our nursing work. They're the ones who are building our fortifications, repairing our railroads, and keeping our boys on the field. There's a humanization when people see each other suffer, the likes of which I don't see on the battlefield as much. It happens on these rare occasions where men would share some water, would pull each other to a place of safety. But in cases of diseases and urban areas, it's rampant. Human beings become very human.
Okay, excellent. Tom, it's another great presentation. I think everybody picked up a lot of interesting information from it. Any last comments before we let you go?
I miss you guys. I miss being live. Can't wait for this to come back, for this normalcy to go away. I hope everything goes great in September. It's going to be wonderful for you guys. I can see the big crowd already, and I hope to see you soon myself.
All right. Hey, Tom, really, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sean. Thanks, everybody.